hungry little mouse. For as long as he could remember, Brian Lamb read stories about the pirates of the Sandcastle. Rumor had it that stolen treasure was hidden in the town, somewhere between the beach to deep within the forest. He took pictures of landscaping for years before he even noticed the small crack inside of the cliff. For months, he watched for anything coming in or out of the crevice. Nothing ever entered or left, but it was the small place in the small city that he hadn't yet searched. Most people just laughed when he told them there might be a cave behind the wall of rock, but he knew that there had to be something there. It was just too obvious, and he was quite surprised that it went undiscovered for hundreds of years. He gathered together some rock climbing rope and gear. Since he was going alone, he didn't want to overpack, so he left the backpack at home. Instead of his normal attire of skinny jeans, he slipped on a pair of tan capri shorts. He didn't plan to be there overnight, just long enough to confirm his suspicion. If he was right, then he would go back later with a crew. Becoming a part of the town's history excited him and just made him want to hurry up and get to the cliff. With one swift motion, he pulled together his long blonde hair and tied it into a small band, forming a man bun. "I'll be back later, Mom," he said as he gave her a hug. He didn't want her knowing where he was going, for she would try to stop him from doing anything dangerous. At 30 years old, he felt a little dismayed, not having a career and still living at home with his mother. But maybe his discoveries and love of nature would bring him the fame he was looking for to relieve him from the situation. Working at a local coffee shop, Ocean Grounds, did not offer him much of an income, but as his mother was willing to let him live there after a divorce, he was more than willing to oblige. "Be safe," she smiled. This was the answer he expected from her, and loved it every time she said the words, knowing she meant what she said. He waited until everyone left the beach area, because he didn't want people gathering around to see what he was doing. It was bad enough. The Miller mansion was sitting on the top of that very spot, as it would call attention to him. He also didn't want people seeing him trying to get into what he thought might be a cave, as he wanted to be sure first. Humiliation is something he wasn't good at taking, and he would hear it for months if his friends watched him climb the side of the cliff. "I'm going to beat you," he said as he started his way up the side. To his dismay, there was nowhere to securely anchor the rope within reach, so he started up the side of the cliff, the hard way. The first few steps were easy, as the sand was pushed up high from the earlier tide. As he climbed higher, he knew it would get more difficult. Fortunately, the side of the cliff had many embedded rocks he could step and grab onto. This must be the way the pirates made it up the cliff, he mused as he continued to scale the side. As his hand gripped the side of the cliff, Brian felt the rocks shift beneath his feet. He looked down for a brief second and watched the insecure rocks fall to the rocky beach, around 30 feet beneath him. For the next few seconds, he held his breath and waited with his eyes tightly shut looking down was a mistake, and he knew it, that it was something anyone would have done in his position. The full height of the cliff was approximately 3,000 feet, but the cave looked to be only about 100 feet up. But still, he knew he probably would not survive or fall into the rocky beach below. The shifting stopped, and he let out a huge sigh. Shaking, he grabbed a bigger rock with his right hand. He pulled up his left foot and firmly placed it onto the next rock. One step after another, he climbed the side until he was finally at an opening to crack the side of the hill. "I knew it," he smiled as he turned sideways and carefully sidestepped through the tight opening. Once inside the cave, he realized it was much bigger than he expected. After all these years, no one ever dared to even find out if a cave even existed here. He was the first one to figure it out, or so he thought. When he looked across the opening, he noticed something in a dim light that looked like bones. He could barely see them, as the sun was setting but offering a faint orange glow inside the cave. He pulled a flashlight from his belt and turned it on. Shocked, he noticed the mummified bones were old. He counted 5 skulls and over 9 feet. Attached at the knee of one of the skeletons was a metal rod. He noticed there were only 8 hands. One person had left a hand and another only a right. There was also belt buckles, buttons, coins, and even boot buckles. But anything made from organic material that was not metal or bone was gone. He took out his cell phone and began taking pictures of the bones and the surroundings. But when he tried to upload the photos to his social media, there wasn't a signal for cellular data or Wi-Fi. Knowing he could upload all of his pictures later, he took close-ups of the coins and buckles while pocketing as many as he could. His pants had very few pockets, and he had to keep one open for the cell phone, as he couldn't carry it all the way down the cliff. "I suppose I'll leave the rest of it to the museum," he sighed. The thought of his finds proudly displayed at the local Sandcastle Museum, or possibly even the Smithsonian, excited him. He could generate buzz through social media, and his work would finally pay off. He enjoyed taking pictures of everything, which included secluded caves, treasures, and pictures of wild animals. During his nature walks and rock climbing adventures in Sandcastle, he came across many different exotic finds, such as strange animal species, treasures left by pirates, crafts by American Indians, and other unique prizes. Finding a huge pirate treasure that was just a rumor in the town would settle the history arguments by many of the town's inhabitants, and he would be famous. Walking around and examining the rest of the small cave, he noticed something wet dripping down from the ceiling and down the wall, further from the light. He could barely see the shine of the wetness from the disappearing sun, and as he pointed his phone flashlight on the wall, he noticed a trail of wetness. Looked a bit like oil. He dipped his finger into the peculiar liquid and then smooched it between his fingers. The texture was sticky and rather disturbing. Even worse, once the smell reached his nose, he recoiled in disgust. It smelled almost like old blood. He followed the trail of goo with his eyes until he reached a crevice in the rock. There, between two stone pallets, he noticed a hand from where the black ooze dripped. Carefully, he stepped on a large stone under the appendage and peered inside the crack. He cringed when the stench hit his nostrils, almost knocking him off the rock. The body was somewhat fresh, and at the point where it was beginning to decay, pockets of black blisters were forming on the skin around the torso. The face was gone, but the eyes remained in a haunted stare of death. For a brief moment, Brian stood there, wondering who this poor soul was, and then he stopped moving and looked into the darkness. Something was staring at him. It took him a moment to realize what the two yellow orbs were. There were no whites in the eyes, but the reflection of his face was obvious. He met the creature face to face, and for seconds they stared at each other, locked in a challenge, forgetting about the rock he stood on. Brian stepped backward into the air and fell flat on his ass, knocking the wind out of him long enough for the thing to creep out from his hole. Brian took a deep breath and looked at it while crawling backward on all fours, with his back to the ground. The creature seized out of the hole and jumped to the ground. It was a human form, but its arms and legs were covered in feathers. Where its mouth should have been was a large, sharp beak. It screeched as it stepped forward to Brian, sticking out its neck and bobbing its head. The human-like bird struck its arms out, away from the sides and from underneath the flesh wings, and folded to a massive size. It pulled its wings back in, and they were arms again, with long, sharp claws with fingers, and both human hands. Brian, unable to speak or scream, crawled to the opening of the cave. As he did, it scuttled behind him, and as he reached the opening, he felt only one sharp talon tear down his calf. He screamed, hooking his rope around the rock and flinging it down the side of the cliff. Suddenly, falling 30 feet into the rocks on the beach didn't look so bad to him, while the creature's long, sharp fingers ripped apart its leg. He edged towards the cave entrance and felt a talon pin him down to the ground through flesh near his Achilles tendon. He screamed, still pulling himself towards the cave opening, and feeling his foot lodge from the socket. The monster had torn so much of his leg that his foot popped right, and as it bled, he grabbed the rope and flung himself outside into the fog. He knew he was losing a lot of blood and feeling faint, but he knew he had to warn people of what was in the cave. As the creature crawled out of the entrance and stretched its huge wings into the air, Brian snapped a few pictures with his phone until he could mentally and physically not hold it any longer. He watched his cell phone drop into a thick pile of ice plants with violet flowers down below the cliff, as he prayed someone would find it for proof or whatever was going to happen with him. His eyes closed right before the creature's talons closed around its body and yanked the rope around its body off of his anchor. Gold coins and buckles fell from his pockets. When the monster flew high into the fog, he was barely conscious, and it stopped flying and hovered somewhere over the forest of Sandcastle. Brian ignored his own advice of never looking down and cried when he saw the 4 open mouths of baby owl-like creatures begging for the food, with their human bodies covered in pin feathers and fluff. They squeaked with large beaks. The predator dropped into the nest, and he felt their beaks upon his legs. Brian grabbed the side of the nest and pulled himself to the edge until one large claw stepped down on his back, cracking it in two, taking the back of his calf into his beak. The beast stripped the flesh from his leg. 4 hungry little mouths opened and waited for a piece, and it dropped into the beak of the first human owlet, while the others cried for the helpings. And the cryptid owl grabbed another piece of Brian's leg to feed its hungry spawn. The world dimmed in Brian's eyes, along with his dreams to become famous. "Maybe they'll find my phone," he whispered as the darkness consumed his life. Thank you all so much for listening to tonight's story. Now I'd like to take a moment to thank all of my Patreons who helped make this channel possible. Thank you, Breaker19, for all your help and support. You guys are amazing.